Monica Gattinger is the director of the University of Ottawa's Institut for Science, Society and Policy. I reached her in the nation's capital. Trevor Toome is an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary. He joined me in studio. Monica, if you could remind us what Canada is supposed to be doing by 2030.
Canada has committed to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% from 2005 levels. So that was a commitment that was made initially under the federal government of Prime Minister Harper and then recommitted to by the current Liberal government.
Are we on track?
Nowhere near on track. I think it bears pointing out that Canada has an unbroken record of overpromising and under-delivering when it comes to climate commitments. Certainly the government at the federal level is indicating that they still intend to meet that target, but it as the years go by, it becomes more and more an open question about the feasibility of meeting that in such a short time period.
So, Trevor, I want to hit you with a scenario here. What if we go the leave it in the ground route, or at least no more pipelines? What would that get us emissions-wise? What would it mean economically?
So the effect of no new pipelines is to increase the gap between the price that oil producers in Canada receive relative to world oil prices. We call that the differential. And that differential, it's always there, but it kind of reflects transportation costs. And pipelines are the lowest cost way of exporting our oil. So without new pipelines, we'll export more and more by rail and sometimes by truck. And that's pretty costly. And so producers receive less. So investment will fall. So oil production will be lower if we have no new pipelines, and that will affect emissions because we emit greenhouse gases for every barrel that we produce. The National Energy Board did some analysis on this very question, and they find that if we don't have any new pipelines, then oil production in Canada would be about 10% lower than it would have otherwise have been by the middle of the next decade. And based on average emissions intensity, that's going to reduce emissions by somewhere around 10 million tons per year. But the foregone economic activity from lower oil production and the wider differential is equivalent to somewhere between $15 to $20 billion per year.
With a B.
With a B. So that's $1,500 to $2,000 per ton of avoided emissions. And so while blocking pipelines is almost surely a way to lower emissions, it is a particularly high cost and inefficient way to lower emissions.
Monica, pipelines have become a proxy for the larger debate over climate action. Where does that leave us?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to bear in mind that when it comes to the emissions from a barrel of oil, 80% of the emissions that are released from a barrel of oil are released when it's consumed, not when it's produced. And as a result of that, I think we're often missing, some of our debates are missing that, yes, we can turn this into an upstream debate about shutting in the oil sands and then pipelines become a substantial target in that context. But doing so doesn't necessarily address the broader question, which is how are we going to go about reducing emissions across the entire economy?
I want to try another scenario with you both. Let's say we don't get too fussed about emissions because, hey, globally we're a small fraction of the problem, as the argument goes. So drill, baby, drill. I know this is a tricky scenario because there are so many variables, but where would that put us by 2030? What could it mean economically and for the planet? Trevor, I'll start with you.
Well, if we don't enact any new policy measures and roll back what has been announced, we'd be emitting around 720 or so million tons in 2030. And so that's more than 100 million tons above where we think we're headed now under current announced pan-Canadian policies. And so rolling back carbon pricing, eliminating the clean fuel standards, for example, that would have a real effect on emissions in the future. And the effect on economic growth would be fairly modest. I mean, if we look at what are the effects for Canada's GDP growth, for example, from the announced carbon pricing federally, we anticipate that would shave about 0.1% per year off GDP growth between now and 2020. So the cumulative effect would be that GDP would be about 0.4% smaller. And that's fairly modest relative to the emissions reductions that such a measure would achieve.
Monica, what do you think it looks like if we don't make a shift to a lower carbon economy? Are there risks with the status quo?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I would come at this more from the perspective of politics. So one of the things that we've seen over the last number of years in Canada is that, Canadians, and you look at public opinion polling data, Canadians are looking for, responsibly produced resources. The majority of Canadians support oil and gas development. They even support increases in oil and gas development, but they want to see that done responsibly. So I think what we haven't been able to achieve in the country to date is, sort of a shared view, a shared vision of what Canada's energy future looks like in the age of climate change.
So, Monica, if you had to chart out a different scenario for us, what would Canada's oil industry look like by 2030? What would we be doing over the next decade?
Well, that's obviously a really tough question. I sure wish I had a crystal ball on that one.
The hopes and dreams part of the interview.
Somewhere in between, leave it in the ground and drill, baby, drill, is a scenario of positive, steady progress on reducing emissions, on developing energy resources responsibly, on, to the extent that it's possible. And increasingly we're seeing this in the oil sands. Producers that are able to produce a barrel of oil from the oil sands with a lower GHG emissions profile, those improvements over the last decades, in some instances just over the last few years, have really been quite remarkable. And that positive progress that is not buffeted by policy reversals and policy swings from one side to the other, that to me would be the third scenario that I think, certainly the public opinion polling research that we've done would suggest Canadians could get behind, but governments need to be very serious about attending to not only the environmental impacts of energy development, but also the social impacts as well, and thinking about things like in reconciliation with Indigenous communities and the proper involvement of municipalities and other local actors who are impacted by energy development.
Trevor, what's your vision here? What should happen over the next decade if you had your way?
Yeah, so I guess I approach this question a little bit differently. I don't look to any particular sector or any particular activity as having some special responsibility to lower emissions. I mean, there are millions of decisions that individual Canadians as households and as businesses make that have consequences for our emissions. And so therefore there's millions of individual ways we can lower emissions. And I think our goal from a public policy perspective should be to lower emissions in the least cost way. I mean, a ton is a ton is a ton. And if we can avoid emitting a ton over here, that is just as good as avoiding emitting a ton over there. So for oil and gas, I'd say that if we have an economy-wide price on emissions and a price that genuinely reflects what we think the environmental consequences of a ton of emission is, the price itself is an incentive to innovate and adopt new and better techniques, then we should just let the oil and gas sector be.
You've both given us a lot to think about. Thanks very much for doing this.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Trevor Toome is an economics professor at the University of Calgary, and Monica Gattinger is the director of the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy.